You're listening to the Author Diary Entries podcast. I'm your host, Sagan Morrow, and this is episode number 198. Access the show notes and transcript of this episode at saganmorrow.com/podcast. We are officially just 2 weeks away from release day for my next Why Choose romance novella, Love by Design. Very exciting. It is now available for pre-order at your favorite ebook store or visit saganmorrow.com/books. Link is in the show notes. In today's episode, I am going to share behind the scenes all about the writing and editing experience for this book, overall how it went, and then the specific processes that I went through and what I was working on for various rounds of writing and rewriting and editing. And then I'm also going to share with you the specific number of hours that it's taken me to complete this novella. As a reminder, this book, Love by Design, is the sequel to Small Town Stilettos. It is a very cute forced proximity, why choose, insta-attraction, friends to lovers, small town romcom. You can learn more about it and the back of book blurb in the previous episode of this Author Diary Entries podcast, episode 197. Now, let's get into the writing and editing process for Love by Design. The overview. This has been the easiest book for me to write since the first novella that I published back in 2018. I think that part of that is because I haven't been putting pressure on myself. With Love by Design, I wasn't trying to hit a specific word count or add layers of storylines and subplots. If I had an idea but it wasn't quite working, then I scrapped it. I was pretty ruthless with that. Whereas in my last couple of books that I've published, I pushed through to make some of those scenes work. I was also trying to write full-length novels rather than novellas. I was trying to kind of extend my comfort zone a little bit with, normally I write novellas, but I was trying to write full-length novels with the last couple of books that I published. So and in that case, because I was trying to make longer books, I was deliberately searching for the side plots. Now, I do not think that that is a problem in those books. They still worked really well. I'm still happy with the end result. I like the way that they turned out. But that being said, writing this story, Love by Design, as a novella, as a book where I wasn't attempting to write a full-length novel, I was really just focused on what is the story that I want to tell. Doing that has really confirmed for me what I do best as a writer and what style works well for me. So that's been very lovely to truly recognize that I work best writing novellas. That's been really great to just kind of let that sink in and fully embrace that moving forward with the books that I write. One aspect that I had a lot of fun with in the writing of this novella is that Ripley, the main character of Love by Design, sees the world through fabric and fashion. When she's driving on the road, it stretches out before her like a ribbon. The stars in the sky are twinkling like rhinestones to her. The snow on the ground looks like freshly laundered linen. So I really enjoyed doing some research into some different fabrics and exploring what the world can look like through that lens. If you are, if you're seeing the world through fabric, through fashion design, what does that get to look like? So that was very fun. And I think, it also makes for some very pretty prose throughout the story. There's some really lovely little descriptions in there. So that was fun to write. And it's also beautiful to read. As I mentioned in the previous episode here on the Author Diary Entries podcast, this book is the best book that I have written to date. I adore all of my books. I'm always proud of what I publish. And I'm also, I think, I really like critiquing things. So I don't shy away from acknowledging when a book is not as good as it could be, or when I feel like, okay, like this it's a good book, and also there could be more to it, So I adore all of my books. I'm proud of what I publish, and also I recognize the limitations of them. And I know for myself as an author, I know that I am a decent author, and I also know that I have a long way to go as an author. It's a journey. We always can continue improving and evolving and growing over time. And the more that we expand our creativity, the more that we write, the better that we will get. The more that we are learning these things, the more that we are going through the experience and the process of it. But all of that being said, it was, knowing that I adore all of my books and I'm proud of what I publish. It's been incredible to see how much more strongly I feel that way about Love by Design. This is the 10th novella that I'll have published. This is book 10, the 10th work of fiction that I will have published. And it's really interesting to see that it's taken me 10 books to feel this satisfied with one of them. And again, I'm satisfied with all of them. I'm happy with all of them, but this book just it hits different, So that's a little overview of Love by Design. Now, let's talk about the specific processes and methods that I used for writing, rewriting, revising, editing Love by Design. If you like getting nerdy with the technicalities of writing and editing, this is a good episode for you. So I started out by rereading the first book in this duology. Love by Design is book 2 in the Small Town Stilettos duology. So the prequel to this novella is Small Town Stilettos, A Modern Marriage of Convenience. And so I reread that book, which I'd published back in 2023. I reread that book this spring, and I made a bunch of notes for what aspects I wanted to build upon in Love by Design. Different character notes, different notes about the setting, anything that as I read through Small Town Stilettos, I was like, ooh, let's do a little callback to in Love by Design to that particular thing. So it was very helpful to reread that book. I also, at this stage of the process, read a document that I had written several years back. I wrote this document when I was essentially publishing Small Town Stilettos. And this document included 7,000 words of various scenes that I wanted to put into Love by Design. It was basically like a mishmash of scenes for the manuscript of Love by Design. So I read through that document, and that just reminded me what I had initially been thinking about doing when I first came up with the concept for this book a few years back. Then I did my tarot spread to do the chapter by chapter outline for Love by Design. I share more about that in episode 196 of this Author Diary Entries podcast. And so I did this tarot spread. I did a tarot reading where I chose a different card for each chapter. And after that, after I'd done my tarot reading, I then mapped out in more detail what I wanted to include in each chapter of Love by Design as a result of that. And I also made note of some specific tropes that I wanted to include in this book. Once I'd done that, I'd figured out, okay, here's my actual plan for each chapter. I was then able to go back through those 7,000 words that I'd written a few years previously, and I culled them. I decided to get rid of, I think it was about a third of it, that just did not fit especially the tone. That was a big piece of it. The tone that I was thinking initially a few years back, it was for some reason I had it a little bit more dramatic than comedic. And there was just a few scenes that simply did not work at all. So I just scrapped that completely. And then the remaining piece of that 7,000 words that I kept, I knew that about half of it would likely need heavy rewrites. They were pretty messy as well, in the sense that they were a mishmash of scene snippets or little bits and pieces of dialogue. So at this point, I took some time to rearrange the ones that I wanted to keep into specific chapters that I thought would make the most sense. So I kind of reorganized them into rough chronological order so I'd be able to copy and paste them into the manuscript when I got to that specific chapter. Next, I mapped out my schedule for writing and editing this book. I carved out space in my calendar for exactly when I would write which chapters, when I would edit specific chapters, and so on. I had it all mapped out for every, very specific days over the course of a couple months. That helped me figure out what other tasks would need to be moved around in the other aspects of my business. And it also gave me a clearer picture of what was realistic in terms of writing and editing and publishing the novella. I love planning things out like this and being able to see very clearly what is my course of action and what is realistic for me. If I want to write and publish a novella like within a specific time frame, given all of the other things that I have going on, and given how much time and energy it takes to do this task versus that task, what does that actually look like? What is feasible and doable for me? And then mapping it all out so I know exactly what I'm supposed to do at what point throughout the process. Okay, and then after I'd done all of that, I began writing. It was finally time to actually write. I wrote the first draft in a linear fashion. So that was chapters 1 to 11 in order. There are 11 chapters in Love by Design. This first draft was really about getting the story on the page. It was about focusing on what the characters wanted me to know and the story that they wanted to tell. By the time that I finished the first draft, I was at just over 24,000 words in total. After I'd written that first full draft, I went back to the beginning of the manuscript and I edited it from start to finish. This round of editing was more about like writing and, doing sort of rewrites and adding things in and revising. A lot of what I was doing here was adding in anything that I had skipped in the first draft. So for example, in the first draft, there were multiple sections where I wrote things like, expand on a description of the person here, or, these two characters should have a conversation about XYZ in this spot. Or maybe this character should meet this person right here, but I don't know how they're going to meet or what should happen. Figure this out later. That was what I did. This is one of the best ways for me to write a fast first draft. Anytime that something feels a bit sticky, I just make a note to deal with it later, and then I keep moving forward. I just keep going. The second draft for me is very much about filling in those spaces and cleaning things up. And I also want to do a disclaimer here. As always, I hope that this goes without saying, but I'm just sharing with you my processes and what works for me at this point in time. This also can change, from one book to the next, or with experience and all of these different types of things. And of course, what works for me is not necessarily what's going to work best for you. It's always important to go with what feels great for our brains. So just a little disclaimer there for you. Okay, so one of the things that I was doing as I went through that second draft of the manuscript was I was flagging anything I wanted to delve deeper into. I made a checklist of different things to review at this point. So for example, this book, Love by Design, is written in first-person POV, and as I said earlier, Ripley sees the world through fabric and fashion. So one of the things that I wanted to check for was, is she actively describing the world in that way? Have I gone 2 chapters without mention of it, and then suddenly there's a random description? Because that would then feel a little bit disjointed. So I wanted to make sure that it was fairly consistent throughout the entire story. Another question I was asking was, am I incorporating it in a way that adds to the story, that enhances the descriptions, rather than making it feel contrived or like it's just being dropped in there and pulls the reader out of the story? I really wanted the reader to feel immersed in the story, to feel like they are also seeing the world through Ripley's eyes. So that's a really important piece there. Another example of something that I was doing at this stage, something that I was kind of flagging for, was that we discover early on in Love by Design that the love interest, Logan, is an artist. And In my first draft of the book, which I discovered as I was, going through it in the second draft, I only mentioned it the one time. I only mentioned that he was an artist at the beginning of the book. And as I was reading through it and doing these, revising it in the second draft, it just felt wrong. It felt incorrect that I had only mentioned it at the beginning of the book. It felt like it was a missing piece. And I realized that it would be better, it would be so much stronger to make his artistry a more important part of the story. So that was one of the things that I started to build upon during the rewrites, and I specifically was flagging that at this point in the writing and editing process. And this actually led to one of the most important observations that the main character Ripley makes at the end of the book. One of my favorite things about the writing process is discovering those sorts of ways in which a seemingly small scene that we've written can pave the way to connect the dots later on. I think that's so cool and it's so fun. An interesting note at this stage of the process: the writing in Love by Design felt quite simple when I was doing the initial edits, right? Doing this second draft. And I use the terms writing and editing very interchangeably because of the nature of how I approach rewrites and revisions and edits. So if I'm using the term editing, but I'm talking about revising and rewriting, it's all kind of, it's all variations of the writing and editing process. But yeah, I found that my writing, it felt quite simple. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. But it was just an interesting observation during that first set of edits. Not that I think that my writing has become complicated or overly complex over the years or anything like that. But in my first pass of this novel, the style of this story really harkens back to my earlier works. And I kind of like that simpler writing because it gives me more space to tell the story and to be with the characters. So that was just, I don't know, I kind of liked seeing that. After I did that, I went through my manuscript in full and read it out loud. So at this point, I think we were at the third draft, essentially. So I zoomed in, and again, very similar to the way that I approach the writing and editing process, where it can kind of be some pieces of editing during the writing process, some pieces of writing during the editing process. I don't necessarily think of my books as doing them as like, this is the, first, like I look at the early drafts as like a first and second draft, and then they sort of start to get a little bit less concentrated around like, this is a third draft, this is a fourth draft. It's more just like going through it multiple phases, and it kind of gets quicker and quicker as I'm going through the entire manuscript in that sort of fashion. Okay, so at this point, I went through my manuscript in full and I read it out loud from start to finish. I zoomed in super big on the computer screen. I made the text gigantic. And I used my walking pad while I was doing this. So I had my computer propped up so it was high enough. I had my manuscript on one of my monitors. I used my other two monitors to have notes about the book and my editing checklist. And then, yeah, I like using my walking pad for some of my book revisions because it really helps me to keep my brain focused. I love the act of walking while I'm doing this process. It helps me so much. So at this point, I read the entire book out loud. And so that was part of the reason why I had the text so big, so that I could see it while I was walking. And it also made it much more obvious to me when there was a typo or when there was an accidental extra space between words, that kind of thing. So it was very helpful to read the book with the text so big at this point. And reading the book out loud very much helped me to catch awkward sentences that I hadn't noticed before, because you read them differently when they're written down, when you're reading them in your head versus when you are speaking them out loud. You can catch those awkward sentences so much more easily. So it really helped me a lot with that. It also made it much more obvious when I had overused certain words. So that was helpful to note. And again, it's one of those things where when you are speaking it out loud, you can hear it. You can hear it more easily that, oh, that I've used that word 5 times in, 2 pages, versus sometimes you can't quite see that on the page. Or at least I find, for me, that it's easier to hear it than to read it visually on the page for those types of things. At this stage of the editing process, if I couldn't figure out how to improve a word or a sentence within, I don't know, probably 5 or 10 seconds, I highlighted it and I just moved on and kept going. I wanted to move through the story fairly quickly while I was reading it out loud so that I could get a good sense of the overall story as I did it. During this time, I was also considering general word choice, pacing, character development, descriptions, dialogue. All of that was kind of happening in my brain simultaneously. So if there was anything sticky, if there was an awkward sentence that I couldn't immediately see, oh, here's how I'm going to fix it. If there was a word, if there was an overused word or a word that I was like, this isn't quite right, or this could be improved, but again, I couldn't quite figure out how I wanted to improve it or what I wanted to change it to, then I would just highlight it. And I just found that really helped me to keep moving forward with the book rather than getting stuck or bogged down on any specific area. After I did that for the entire manuscript, I then went back through the entire manuscript again from start to finish. And at this point, I dealt with all of those highlighted words, all of the highlighted phrases that I had marked for myself. At this point, I referred to the dictionary and the Chicago Manual of Style a lot to do things like double check spelling, word choice, when to use hyphens versus when to not use hyphens, which is a little bit my kryptonite, to check proper formatting, for instance, when to do uppercase versus lowercase after a colon, all of that stuff. Canadian English is a fun, cute, little weirdo hybrid of British English and American English. So, for instance, I will write words like color in the British way with an OU rather than just an O. But I prefer to write words like organize in the American style with a Z rather than an S. Other Canadians might have different preferences than me. We have a lot of variations to our words depending on personal preference. As a general rule, I default to my copy of the Canadian Oxford Dictionary, but my copy is from 2004, so it's a bit outdated at this point. Same with my copy of the Chicago Manual of Style. I have the 16th edition, so it's from 2010. Fun fact, I used to work as a freelance editor, so that's why I have the Chicago Manual of Style in the first place. And there's also some instances in which I simply have my own preferred style that doesn't fit into this official style guide, in which case I go with my preferred style. To me, it's more important about being consistent within the same book rather than following a particular official style guide. Now, for the next stage of the writing and editing process, I began adding in text messages between each chapter. This is a cute feature that I included in the prequel to Love by Design, so I wanted to add it in again. And what I find is that having text message exchanges between characters in between each chapter really provides a rich extra layer of intimacy connecting the reader to the characters. I love how these exchanges turned out. It was fun to play with which characters should be texting between which chapters, what they should be discussing, how those moments could further the story and help the readers get to see another side of the characters, and so on. Throughout this process, I kept a quick bullet point list indicating who the text messages were between, who they were between at the end of each chapter, so that I could really confirm that it all made sense. I wanted to make sure I was giving all of the characters the amount of page time they deserved, that sort of thing. Now, when I first started doing this, I wasn't intending all of them to be text messages. I was actually thinking about doing some post-it notes in between some chapters. So like little post-it notes that Ripley leaves Logan, or an email between Ripley and her brother Zach. I was going to do that, but the reason why I didn't do that is honestly because I couldn't figure out a seamless way to make that work from a formatting perspective in the book. Like I was looking at it and I was thinking, okay, if I wanted to do this as a post-it note, then I think I would want it to actually be on a little graphic of a post-it note. But then I was thinking about, okay, how do I actually want that to look? Would I want to just draw my own post-it note? Is there an image that I'd be able to use? What does that look like in terms of, copyright, all of that sort of stuff? So that just created an extra layer of complication that I wasn't really willing to explore more deeply. And I also was concerned that it might be a bit jarring for the reader to try to figure out, okay, wait, is this an email? Is this a text message? Is this a post? What is going on here? And so it felt as though if I stuck with the text messages that I had done in Small Town Stilettos, if I did the same thing for Love by Design, it would make it a lot easier, a lot more fluid for the reader. It would make it easier for the reader to read. It would make more sense for them. It wouldn't be jarring. It wouldn't take them out of the story. And instead, what I think ends up kind of happening is that as you're reading the book, you as the reader, you're seeing this text message before the next chapter, and then you're starting to think, ooh, who is going to be texting at the end of this chapter, right? So it kind of gives you this extra little story within a story to kind of pay attention to, which is very fun. After that, after I did the text messages, I then went through another checklist of edits to do. And I had made this checklist of edits while I had read the book out loud. So sometimes when I was reading the book out loud, it wasn't enough to simply highlight a phrase that I wanted to refer back to. Instead, there were some instances when I might get an idea or a thought that I wanted to expand upon. So in that case, I added it to this little list of, little checklist. And at this point, I dealt with that list. It was mostly more minor details like this character should mention X, Y, Z at this point, or remember to do a callback, to this thing from chapter 3, somewhere around chapters 7 to 9. So it kind of gave me these things that had a little bit more, even if it was a small piece to include in the book, it was going to take me a little bit more, finagling to figure out how I wanted to add it in and where it was going to go and all of that. Then I once again reviewed Small Town Stilettos to check for consistency between the two books in the duology. For example, the layout of the town, Fort Edwin, is described in detail in Small Town Stilettos. So because Love by Design is also set in Fort Edwin, I wanted to make sure that I hadn't messed anything up. And at this stage, I had messed something up. I said that the church was beside the gas station in one book, and in another book, and in the other book, I said it was across from the gas station. So that was a very easy fix, and I'm glad that I reread Small Town Stilettos to confirm those types of details. In both books, it's such a throwaway line, but it's important to have that kind of consistency there. Something else that happens in Love by Design is there's a scene where the power goes out and then the generator doesn't kick in. But In Small Town Stilettos, I made a point of noting that the love interest, Logan, has a backup generator because he's a very prepared kind of person. So when I saw that during this particular reread of Small Town Stilettos, it gave me the idea to mention in Love by Design how he had actually given his backup generator to a prominent character from the previous book. I needed a reason for the power to go out. The power going out is a very important part of Love by Design. And I needed there to not be a generator kicking in, and there couldn't be a backup generator. So this, like, realizing that, like, trying to figure out, okay, how do I make this work? How do I make this consistent? This worked out so well. This worked out so well for me to have this idea to then just be like, okay, Logan gave his backup generator to a prominent character from Small Town Stilettos. It was great for 3 reasons. It ensured continuity between the 2 books. It references a character from the first book, which is a fun Easter egg for readers who read the previous book in the duology. And it references important attributes about Logan, the love interest, in that not only is he a very prepared person, but he's also always taking care of other people. He's always looking out for them. He's very generous with helping people out. And all of that was achieved within the space of like 1 or 2 sentences in Love by Design. Those kind of moments are some of my favorites as an author. I love that. I really enjoy as well that kind of, exploratory aspect of the writing process, being able to see, okay, I mentioned this in Small Town Stilettos. This is kind of an issue in Love by Design, but I really need, this is an important part of the plot. So how am I going to make it work? Ooh, we can just add in 2 sentences that suddenly also has these other layers and gives us, as the reader, even like a richer understanding of this character. I love it. It makes me so happy. It gives me chills. Okay, so the next stage of this whole writing and editing process was to once more read each chapter of Love by Design out loud, the entire manuscript from start to finish. This time, I was checking for 3 things. First, awkward sentences, typos, weird word choices, etc. Second, the physicality of the scene. So how are the characters positioned? What movements are they making? And third, expressions in the scene. What are they doing with their faces? In this case, I read a single chapter out loud from start to finish to do the first check of the awkward sentences, typos, word choice, that kind of thing. And then I went back and I scanned through the chapter again, not out loud. And this time I was only looking at the physical action. What are the characters actively doing? How are they relating to one another? Where are they? Are they standing, sitting? How are they moving throughout this chapter, throughout these different scenes? After that, I went back through that same chapter from start to finish, and this time I scanned it, again, not out loud. I scanned it only for expressions. So what are their faces doing throughout the scenes? Once I had done those 3 things in that chapter, I let myself move on to the next chapter to do the same thing for it. This was extremely helpful. At one point, I discovered that Ripley picked up the same bag twice in a scene. Bit of a glitch in the Matrix. So it was really helpful for that type of thing. Looking for expressions also helped me to identify when I said that someone looked sad, rather than expressing how do they look sad. So I was able to clean up some of those areas. Also, by looking at only at the expressions, I could see that the same person did some variation of grinning 5 times in the space of 2 minutes. So that gave me a chance to see where I needed to mix things up and not rely on one type of expression to convey their mood or their attitude. I really liked being able to look at different scenes through those lenses where I was only looking at the physicality of it, only looking at the expressions of it, because you're able to see things differently. Your brain is able to process the scene in a very different way and to look at, okay, Does this make sense? Are they doing the exact same things? What will give more dimension to this scene? Super helpful. And I don't think I've done this for previous books. So this is absolutely something I will be doing for all of my books moving forward. I absolutely loved doing this. It was so helpful. I don't think I've done it for previous books. Okay, so after I did that, the next round of edits was another list that I had created. So as I'd gone through that, chapter by chapter set of edits, I wanted to check to see, okay, is there too much winking? Are the characters winking too much? Are their faces and their eyes lighting up too much? That kind of thing. So this particular round of edits was essentially going through a list that I'd kind of been creating from the previous round of edits. And I was really doing a search for typically overused words and then dealing with them. So I was kind of, as I did that last round of edits where I was, reading it out loud, I would make a quick note of, okay, I think that I'm actually overusing this particular word, and I just made a note of it. I didn't actively change it. So at this point, I'm actually going through that list and searching for those words. For example, I would do I'd use the search function in the document, and I would search how many times I wrote words like begin, began, start, certain, sure, gaze, even, realize, maybe, just, sudden, slow, etc. I currently have 57 words on that list of typically overused words. I did a search for all of them, and I removed or replaced them as needed. This was a fantastic visual to see exactly where I was overusing a word multiple times in quick succession, because when you're using the search function, it highlights the words so you can see it, right? You can actively see on the page, oh, I've used this same word 3 times in 3 paragraphs. Maybe I want to replace that with something different, This is actually a list that I started years and years ago as a reference for my novellas. I think I might have used this right from the start, from the very first book that I wrote. I really like being able to check through it, and with every book that I write, I add more words to the list. When I notice that new words are being overused in a particular manuscript, I just keep on adding words to that list. Some of the words are ones that I no longer overuse, but I still keep them in the list to make sure that I don't resort to overusing them again in the future. It's a good little catch for me, a little checkpoint. It's such a helpful tool to have this list. I will also note here that the way that I figure out when I've overused a word is typically just through the process of doing all of these rounds of writing and reading and revising. Sometimes I will happen to notice that a word appears 3 times on a page, or I will think to myself, I feel like I've already used that turn of phrase a couple times. It sounds kind of familiar. And that is what flags it for me. If I notice it as a reader, that is a sign that I've overused a word. At this stage of the process, the other thing I was doing, alongside doing that search for overused words, is I also did a search for the letters ly to identify adverbs in the manuscript. And at that point, I addressed, okay, what do I want to keep? What do I want to get rid of? What do I want to replace with something stronger? I love my adverbs, so this is a necessary checkpoint. I also keep a good chunk of adverbs, but by doing the search, it helps me to more clearly see where I've gone overboard with them, which ones I'm using more than others, which ones do not need to be there at all and would be much stronger with a different word or phrasing of that sentence. The other thing that I searched here was the word look, and I replaced some of those with what the person was looking at or how they were looking. After that, I did a quick spell check for any errors that might have, otherwise fallen through the cracks. And then I uploaded the manuscript to my Draft to Digital book platform so that it was properly formatted. I had also added in the front and the back matter during one of these stages. I think when I was like, my eyes couldn't handle doing any more editing, I just like started adding in the front and the back matter. So that was, already kind of in there. I can't remember at what stage I started doing the book blurb, but that was something I'd kind of been like tweaking and playing with throughout this process. So I had that in there and I uploaded the manuscript to Draft to Digital and I had it formatted in the same way that it'll be formatted for readers. And then I added it to my Kobo. And this way I could read the book, the entire manuscript, in the exact same format as it will be when a reader is reading it. So I get to actually have the same experience as the reader. Very important stage of the book revision editing process that I do for all of my novels. I then read the entire book from start to finish on my Kobo, and I edited a bunch of things on the computer document as I went. Sometimes I was editing for awkward sentences, but more often than not, it was about making stronger word choices, especially for words like got, or put, or stood, or walked. Those were the major words that I noticed at this stage of the editing process. I was able to more easily see what words would work better in those sentences. And I think this was partly because sometimes, not always, but sometimes when I'm reading a book for pleasure, I will notice those kinds of things and I'll think to myself, ooh, it would have been stronger if the author had like used this other word over here. So my eye can catch that kind of thing more easily on my Kobo than when it's on a computer document because I'm a little bit more used to it. I think they're also that much easier to miss on a computer document because they're such standard words that we just see all the time. And so they're a little bit harder to recognize that there could be a stronger word to use. And so this stage of the editing process was really about identifying like what is the way that this character is walking, right? Like how are they sauntering instead of walking, right? Are they striding forth? And so being able to kind of figure out how is this person actually moving was a good thing to do at this particular stage. And it was much easier to identify those things because I was so deeply immersed in the book, because I was reading it on my Kobo. I was being a reader, not an author, so I could really be in the story, fully in the story. I was reading it and then thinking to myself like, oh, but they're not walking, they're sauntering. Like in my head, I can visually see them sauntering over. Okay, well then walking is the wrong word to have here. I need to change that. So that was a really, really good, really helpful stage of the revision process. And there we go. That has been the entire writing and editing process so far. I have let, at the time of of you listening to this episode going live, I will have let the manuscript rest for a couple weeks, and then I will do one more proofread of it this week, again on my Kobo. If I only find a couple small changes to make, maybe like, 2 typos max, then that's going to be it for the edits. If I notice more than a couple of typos, then I'll do another pass after that. My general rule of thumb as an author is that if I am still noticing typos, that means there are still more that I'm missing. If I get to the point when I'm reading through the final draft and I only find like 1 typo in the entire manuscript, it's probably good to publish. Ideally, I will be able to read through the entire manuscript and go, I had 0 changes to make for that entire read. That's the ideal. And also if I get to a point where there's like 1, maybe 2 typos it's probably pretty well edited. So that's kind of my approach to it. So I probably only have one round of proofreads to do, maybe a couple, because again, I did make a fair number of changes with those gots and puts and studs and walks and things like that. And so there could be like a few instances when, maybe there'll be like an extra space between a word or something like that. So I might need to do a couple of rounds of edits just to be sure that I didn't mess anything up there. But I was absolutely delighted with how the book read on my Kobo when I did that last round of review of it. I truly believe that this is the best book that I have written so far, and so it was especially beautiful to feel that way about it, even though I was still doing those minor tweaks and edits to that draft, and like a fair number of minor edits and tweaks to that draft. I loved that I was thinking to myself, okay, if this book was published the way it is right now, it would still be a very solid book. It would still be a really good book. And I am making it even better with these minor changes. I'm making it that much stronger with these changes. So that was just so lovely to have that thought going through my head. So there we go. That was the writing and editing process. Now, wow, this is a very long episode. I love nerding out about this stuff. What can I say? So how long did all of this take me to do the writing and editing? Here's an overview. I logged 2 hours in March, 9 hours in May, 24 hours in June, and 30 hours in July. Honestly, even though I did that many rounds of rewrites and edits, I was not expecting that 65 hours would be the total amount. Not that it feels unreasonable, it feels very normal, especially given that although I can write much faster, on average, I typically write 1,000 words an hour for a book because I'm, thinking about things. I often pause to tweak. Love by Design is a 35,000 word novella, so we can assume approximately 35 hours just to write all of those words, and then let's say like another 30 hours to do rewrites and edits. That makes a lot of sense. So it feels very reasonable that this would have taken me about 65 hours. And also at the same time, it feels like a high number simply because I was just having so much fun with it. Like the time flew by, which is one of the best experiences that you could possibly have as a writer. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when I started the manuscript, before I'd even started it, I already had 7,000 words that I had written a couple years back. Again, I scrapped about a third of it, I reworked another third, and the last third of it was pretty solid. I didn't have to make big changes to it. Given that, I also went through to revise those 7,000 words, I made the decisions of what to keep versus scrap versus revise. I had to reorganize those scenes to figure out where they should fit into my chapter outline. All of that time was logged. So I didn't really want to add a ton of extra time, like guessing how much time it would have taken me to do the 7,000 words. But, let's factor in maybe 4 extra hours to write those 7,000 words. I didn't go back to figure out how much time I'd actually logged. I didn't go back to my time tracking to figure that out. So let's assume maybe an extra 4 hours. So let's just round this up to 70 hours for writing and editing this book, give or take another couple of hours. On top of that, I also, of course, have to put in the time for publishing the book. I separate that piece out from the writing and editing. The publishing side of things involves tasks like writing the book blurb, doing keyword research and identifying tropes, creating the playlist for the book, planning the cover art, doing communications with my cover designer, uploading the manuscript to book platform sites, that kind of thing. In this case, I also did something new that I've never done before in a book, and I drew the town sign for Fort Edwin with the town slogan on it. So I drew it and I, added the font and I added that to the manuscript. So at the very beginning of the book, you get to see the town sign. So that is another piece that, the time that it took me to do that was also factored into the, publishing aspect of the book, the publishing category on my time tracking software. So far, that has been 7 hours in total to do all of those things. Which is, to me, I'm like, when I saw that, when I looked at the time tracking, that felt low. I was like, oh, that's pretty good that I managed to do all of those things, writing the book blurb, putting together the playlist, which takes like a surprising amount of time to do, and, drawing a town sign and figuring out how to do the proper formatting and things like that. It all took me just 7 hours, not bad at all. I mentioned earlier that I mapped out my entire schedule for exactly when I was going to write this chapter versus edit that chapter in advance. And these types of plans, I want you to know, are always an organic living set of plans. I do not follow them to a T because I trust myself. And I know from experience that even when I move tasks to different days, I will still be able to meet deadlines. I stuck pretty closely to the plan, but I also gave myself permission to move things around as needed. It was more that the order of operations stayed the same, and then sometimes I would just move a task a day later or a day earlier, depending on my brain space or other activities I had going on, or whether a given task took longer or shorter than expected, or sometimes I might add things in where I was like, oh, I actually want to do another run through of this chapter, right? Like another round of edits or revisions. I'm going to add that in here. As I mentioned, I will be doing at least one more final proofread of this book before publishing day, one last pass to check for typos, and then I will finish uploading the book to all publishing sites. So let's anticipate maybe another 4 hours for the writing and editing side of things. Let's anticipate maybe another 4 hours for the publishing side of things, for like formatting, uploading to all of the different sites, double checking things. That'll bring us to 85 hours in total to plan, write, edit, and publish this book, but that's assuming that I do not need to do a couple more rounds of proofreads after that. So if we want to add in the buffer time, if we want to account for and assume that there will be 1 or 2 extra rounds of proofreads, right? So I'm not just going to do one more round of proofread. Let's assume that there might be a few more proofreading needed to be done. In that case, we could say that it might be closer to 90, maybe 95 hours in total for the writing, editing, and publishing of Love by Design. And a sidebar, that does not include any marketing for the book. That is a whole other beast. Any social media marketing, email marketing, creating graphic, like promo graphics, connecting with advanced review copy readers, like doing podcast episodes, all of these different types of things, all of that is under a totally different set of time tracking, which I am not going to get into for our purposes today. Speaking of marketing, though, a reminder that you can pre-order this novella, Love by Design, at your favorite ebook store or visit saganmorrow.com/books. Link is in the show notes. Now, overall, I primarily worked on this book over the course of 2 months, June and July. I did 2 hours of prep in March, 30 minutes in April, 9 hours in May, 25 hours in June, and 34 and a half hours in July. That was 71 hours over the course of really 8 weeks, especially because I finished all of this on July 21st. So there was actually only 3 weeks in July when I was doing this. That is incredibly cool. I haven't worked on a book this intensely since the first book I published in the Polyamorous Passion series, but that novella was only 23,000 words long, not 35,000 words. And I also didn't have the same sort of like rigorous systems in place for all of my rounds of edits. I still had multiple rounds of edits, but my processes were not as robust as they are now. I love having this hard evidence that it is very doable for me to write and edit and publish a novella within the space of 2 months. Now, this is also a bit different during the summer months when my spouse goes away for stretches at a time to do field work, because that means I can work kind of weird hours on my books when the inspiration strikes. But something that I do think is super cool about this is that I have still been maintaining the rest of my business throughout this process. And I also prepared for and performed in 4 different burlesque shows in the middle of this experience. So it's just been very lovely to see how the book was integrating, honestly, pretty seamlessly into the rest of my life. Writing books is so energizing to me. And as someone who's very much a proponent of anti-hustle productivity, as someone who has really fine-tuned the art of working efficiently without burning out, I can get a full day's worth of work completed in the space of 4 hours, like a lot of work done in that time. And, I have a background as an anti-hustle productivity strategist specializing in solopreneurs. I've been doing this for many, many years. So I've really, fine-tuned this, and I have a lot of expertise when it comes to productivity, especially, based on your personality, based on how your brain works, all that kind of thing. Now, again, based on my energy, I personally typically power down by the time I hit hour 5 in a given day, based on how my brain works, based on, the fact that I have nightmares and insomnia and things like that. Typically 5 hours is my absolute max. And 4 hours is generally my sweet spot for doing work in a day. But there were multiple days throughout the process of working on Love by Design when I was able to just keep going with writing and editing without losing steam, and it increased my energetic capacity to do other tasks as well. I had a 10-hour day when I did that last round of proofreading. That is not the norm for me at all. So I love that book writing gives me so much energy that it just spurs me on and increases my bandwidth like that. Working on my books is magic. So there you have it. That is a wrap on today's unexpectedly, unusually long episode. If you found this helpful and interesting, please do share this episode with your friends and your community on Instagram or Threads and tag me at Sagan Lives so I can repost it and so that I know that you also love nerding out about these types of things just as much as I do. And if you are enjoying the Author Diary Entries podcast, please take 2 minutes to rate and review it on your favorite podcast platform. It means so, so much to me when you do that. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.